Good afternoon. We're going to recommence. I hope you're all enjoying your lunch. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, we hope that you enjoyed your lunch or a little bit of a break and are coming back to us fresh. So we are delighted to have our first keynote of the day this afternoon from Susannah Pierce, Shell Country Chair. Susannah is going to bring an industry perspective to our discussions today from a progressive company that's made net zero commitments to 2050. And what many might not know is that not only for scope 1 and 2, but also for scope 3 emissions. So we're very much looking forward to her remarks on that front. Shell is also a company that has long-standing and deep experience with financing, permitting, and building major projects, with all of the rewards, bumps, and scars to prove it. So thank you, Susannah, very much for agreeing to be with us today. We're keen to hear your perspective on the issues. Everybody has your remarkable bio in the agenda, so I won't take any of your precious speaking time to go over that. And I will cede the floor to you and look forward to moderating the question and answer session following your remarks. Susannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And let me just check, can folks hear me okay?
Yes, you're perfect.
Excellent. So I hope lunch was good. I'm just finishing my my second oat milk latte. It's still early here in Vancouver, where I'm dialing in from, on the traditional ancestral unceded territory, the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I wish I could be with you, but I'm here in Vancouver looking after my 2 kids before they go away for the summer. So I've got to do a little bit of mom duty today. But it's great to have the chance to speak to you here virtually and maybe share with you a little bit of Shell's perspective on the challenges we have and the opportunities, frankly, in a net zero world. But let me take a step first to describe what we are in Canada, because as you would know, Shell is a global company, but Shell has had a long-standing presence in Canada, and you probably see that when you drive around. You might see some Shell gas stations. And my history with Shell Canada goes back about more than a decade. And at that point in time, when I joined in 2009, very much the footprint that we've had in Canada very much mirrors our global footprint in terms of how we're looking at moving from our traditional businesses into our lower carbon businesses. And the great thing for me, and I think for us, frankly, as Canadians, is that Shell's really looking to Canada as a potential critical part of its own energy transition strategy. And that's exciting for me as country chair, because it means that we have the opportunity to create the right investment conditions so that we can help the company, but then also the country meet its climate targets, which again, none of us should think are easy at all, especially given where we are in the world today. But the exciting thing, as Monica mentioned, is, I wouldn't work for Shell unless I could align with the commitment and the strategy that it has towards decarbonization. It's been something that I've been studying ever since I was in graduate school, and something that I think is obviously so vitally important today. But the way that Shell has addressed this, and where you can find out more if you choose to, is through a strategy we call Powering Progress. And that is a strategy which outlines how we can actually generate shareholder value. That's a return on the investments our shareholders give us. How we can use our investments to create greater wealth across society, what we call powering lives. How we can make sure that our strategy is consistent with a view of respecting nature, that is being aware of our impacts on the air, on water, on biodiversity. And in all of that, achieve our targets of becoming a net zero company by 2050. And as Monica said, net zero for us is not just the typical scope 1 and 2 that you would understand comes from the greenhouse gas protocol, but it also includes scope 3. And maybe just as for those that aren't familiar with what scope 1, 2, and 3 mean, let me start with scope 1. These are the emissions that we produce when we produce energy from oil and gas exploration, from processing, refining, and chemicals production. Scope 2 are the emissions or indirect emissions that we cause to be created when we buy energy to run our operations. This is things like electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. And then finally, scope 3. These are our customers' emissions. So in other words, if you go to our Shell gas station, you fill up your car, that's our scope 3. Your scope 1, our scope 3. And these are the emissions that come from the energy products that we sell, but also the life cycle emissions of the energy products that we buy from others and sell to our customers. And in terms of scale and scope, when you think about Shell's position in the overall energy system, we contribute just close to 5% of energy consumption has come from Shell. So you can see that we have a fairly profound integration or impact in the global energy system, which the way that I position that creates a huge opportunity for us to also have an impact in terms of how do we change the energy system, again, albeit as challenging as that may be. But the important thing I want to just highlight here for this group is that when we think about our net zero challenge, scope 1 and 2 are really the emissions that are within our control. Scope 3 are really the emissions that are in our customers' remit. But our big challenge is that 90% of the emissions we need to get to for net zero are our customer emissions. So why are we doing this? And is that even sensical? Well, the way we look at it is it creates an opportunity, again, for us to work with an energy system, to work from the customer back, to create that kind of coordinated movement to achieve decarbonization outcomes. And the exciting thing I would just add for us right now, if you compare to where we are today to where we were a few years ago, it used to be the focus just on the suppliers or the producers, but now the customers are saying, what do we do? How do we actually work with you? So by addressing emissions of our customers, it's something that I would argue, and I think we could all say, is probably one of the most comprehensive targets in the industry. And it requires that we become more efficient in our operations. It requires that we design our manufacturing centers and chemicals plants to produce lower carbon energy. But it also remains for those emissions that we can't eliminate right away, that we find ways of capturing and storing those, whether that's using carbon capture sequestration I can talk about, or even nature. And that's really important as well. We need basically an all tools on deck. It also means that when we think about what our customers need, we have to work with them in terms of making sure that they are prepared to take some of these lower carbon energy products, which may be biofuels, which may be hydrogen, it may be EV, how we work with them to make sure that they have the confidence that if they purchase electric vehicles, they know where they can charge them. And they also know that the electricity that they purchase through these vehicles is renewable. So in order to establish or to achieve this net zero target, I'll just spend a minute in saying how we're doing it. Obviously, every target has to have a plan. We need to measure how you go along the way. And so we have short, medium, and long-term targets. These are primarily carbon intensity targets. But we also, just in this last year, to really focus on what we can do on scope 1 and 2, we also set a goal to reduce absolute emissions of scope 1 and 2 50% by 2030 compared to 2016 levels. And so that means for us, again, how do we really focus on the emissions within our control? And we've been doing, I would argue, a pretty good job. Just this year, we released our energy transition report. That is a report which goes to shareholders. It's on the web. And you will see that we have already been able to achieve an 18% reduction in scope 1 and 2 from 2016 levels. And again, that is a commitment we've made and we make public in terms of our progress in our energy transition report. But each type of emissions, as you would likely know, takes a different approach. And so let me just spend a minute on that. So for scope 1 emissions, the majority of these emissions come from our downstream business. And so that's primarily refining and chemicals, followed by emissions from our integrated gas business, which is really gas to liquids, which is LNG. And so we are focused in that regard and what we can do to eliminate those emissions. And primarily some of the strategies we have there is looking at becoming more efficient. It's looking at how we can actually look at using carbon capture sequestration to store away carbon emissions. But carbon capture sequestration also has a role in scope 3 I'll spend a minute on as well. And I'm pleased to say that when we think about, again, our chemicals and energies parks, one of the areas where we're looking to really focus on and have been is right here in Canada. And that's our Shell Scotford Chemicals and Energies Park, which is near Edmonton, Alberta. This is the park where we are already, from a refining capacity perspective, more efficient than any other refinery in Canada. And we've also been operating the Quest project for some time now. And that is a project which started as a pilot project, but has demonstrated that carbon capture sequestration works. And this project has essentially stored close to 7 million tons over its lifetime from 3 hydrogen plants in the upgraded facility. So again, showing that we can reduce our scope 1, showing that CCS can work, and showing that we can do it here in Canada. Now, scope 2, again, these are the emissions dimension that come from when we buy energy to run our operations. The primary focus for here has been on how we can accelerate investments in renewable power. So you see us spending commitments or making commitments and equity investments in renewable power generation, but then also in power purchase agreements, as we have done with Blue Earth for wind power in Calgary, as well as incentivizing and working with partners such as Silicon Branch to build solar projects, which then connect to our facility. So really scope 2, we're focused on renewable power supplies to help to decarbonize that source for us as well. Now, as I mentioned, the big challenge for us is scope 3. And this is probably going to be the predominant part of where I spend time in my remarks, because it's a predominant area where we clearly have to work with our customers to help accelerate their change so we can accelerate our change. And I think the probably part of the conversation you've experienced today is, well, how does this happen right now, especially when we recognize with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the world feels to have changed significantly, and it has. I mean, we've seen the tragedy that we see every day happening in Ukraine. We are experiencing energy prices and the misalignment between demand and supply, and it's really had a huge impact, and I think raised in profile energy security and energy affordability. But it also has not, in my view, taken the foot off the pedal as it relates to decarbonization. In fact, I think what we're seeing even more so is that while we need to address the energy demands today, the climate challenge doesn't go away. So how do we actually do that while we are accelerating investments in cleaner technologies and cleaner energy sources? And this is not easy. We recognize that. Shell is in this position, of course, as a global energy company. We're really at the heart of it. But does this change our strategy? And it's pretty clear from the top of the house all the way down that in a time of great uncertainty like we're experiencing today, it does not. It remains vital that our long-term energy strategy remains on track. We've published the strategy. We continue to work towards the strategy. You've heard me talk about the decarbonization we've been able to make in the last year. And so we'll continue to focus on that. But it even means more so that we work with our customers back. And so how do we do that? And I think that the important thing for us to focus on here is it means even more so that we need to focus on collaboration with our customers and with policymakers. Because helping our customers switch to lower carbon energy will not happen in and of itself, because we know that today the systems are not in place, the technology investments haven't been made. We know that it's as much as, if not more expensive. So what is the role of government? Because government can put in the policies, regulations, and incentives and mandates to make the changes that we need at pace. And Shell is here to work with governments so that we can help identify those opportunities. And so if you spend a moment with any of the folks from Shell, or if you look online, you will see that we have produced some policy papers that specifically looked at different sectors. And you'll also see that we've created some work with one of our partners, Deloitte, so that we can have a closer look at sectors. So for example, what would it take for the aviation sector to change? What would it take for the shipping sector to change? How do we make a real impact on road transport? So again, focusing on where our biggest emissions are, scope 3, working with our customers and sectors, and then working with governments so they can establish the right regulatory and policy enablers is absolutely as critical today as it ever has been. Because I think, again, if you follow the climate science, if you recognize the challenges we don't have time to wait for 30 years for the next wave of technologies to get to scale. And as an investor, we want to make the investments today, but the investments won't happen unless they're investable. And this is, I think, the key thing for us. As an investor, we need predictability. So major investment decisions that we would make in CCS require years of planning, permitting, and a reliance on the regulatory system that we see today. And that means that we need to make sure, again, that we're working with government and regulators so that they understand these challenges. If I spend a second just on carbon capture sequestration, we've talked about the investment tax credit. That is an example of something which is an upfront incentive that can help mitigate some of the uncertainty that comes from some of the policy and regulatory levers that are not yet in place. That helps us as an investor to feel a little bit more comfortable with these types of investments that we need to make that are substantial. Now, when I think about investment or investors and investments, the other thing that I spent a long time thinking about is, well, we can have greater certainty and fiscal supports, but if we can't get through the regulatory system in a timely fashion, that also has an impact on investment decisions. So if we think about the regulatory and decision-making processes that have been set up, just like we've looked at it in our company, they've been very focused on traditional lines of business. But now we're saying, how do we actually accelerate investments across sectors and across systems and across value chain? So this takes a different type of regulatory attention. It takes a different type of policymaker attention, and it takes a different level of coordination. A great example of how we're seeing this evolve in Canada, I would argue, is in hydrogen. So you have a federal hydrogen plan, you have an Alberta hydrogen plan, you have a BC hydrogen plan, and that's great. I think these plans are recognizing the interdependencies across the value chains and some of the things that need to happen in concert in a coordinated fashion to make these investments happen. Great example in the hydrogen space I often refer to is actually here in Vancouver, where when you drive from the airport and you pretend you're going downtown, you might come straight down Granville, if you look to your right, just about 5 minutes from the airport, you'll see a Shell station. And you'll see that we have an HTEC hydrogen pump there. And it's great, it's wonderful, we've had it there for years. The challenge is that HTEC hydrogen pump is taking away space from a traditional fuel pump. But the HTEC hydrogen pump hasn't really been utilized as much as you would hope, simply because people aren't driving hydrogen cars. Now that will change, but what we need to do now as business, as industry, as government and policymakers is find ways of shortening that cycle so that we don't have to have a pump at the station waiting for people to get the cars. We need to coordinate policy, we need to coordinate regulatory decision-making and do so in an accelerated fashion, requires collaboration. And so that is where, again, how we look at, we can do that is say, governments, you've got existing regulatory processes, you know how to utilize them. But now if you want to make systemic change, you better do a better job of working across government systems, working across government policies and regulatory agencies. This means you need to coordinate, you need to streamline, and you need to eliminate duplicative data and decision-making. So how can you come together saying, this is the system we want to create, what are the various different decisions that need to be made across the system? How can we streamline that and coordinate that so we can accelerate across that ecosystem so that as a producer, I produce cleaner energy, and as a consumer, they're prepared to take it, and it's economic. So that is one of the big challenges I think we have in front of us. It's not impossible. It's not impossible to do. And this is something which I put into the room as a challenge we all need to come together and try to focus on. And again, I'm seeing things happen in various provinces where there is attention to that. I was pleased to see that the BC Centre for Innovation and Clean Energy was focused on some of that. They're looking at some of the regulatory roadmap with the government of BC. So that's good, but we need to do more of that. And it can't just be for hydrogen. It can be a whole number of different technology solutions and sector solutions that we need. So now I want to spend just a second on infrastructure, because I think that's another key component for us as we think of how do we get to our decarbonization objectives. For Shell, we know that the future energy system is going to be one that will still require liquid fuels, low carbon liquid fuels, and it will still require electrification. So how do we adapt our business to that? And this is, again, coming back to the chemicals and energies part. We see the opportunity to leverage the existing infrastructure that we have that can then become the generated and manufacture of lower carbon fuels. And we can do that by tweaking the feedstocks, we can do that by tweaking the refinery, and we can do that leveraging carbon capture sequestration. Carbon capture sequestration, again, is the fundamental building block for the hydrogen system. You have green hydrogen, of course, I'm trying to avoid colors, but you also have the ability to leverage natural gas with CCS to create hydrogen. CCS is a key component to that, and it's something that we can apply to the kit we have today. So that is a really important source for us to also look at leveraging existing infrastructure that enable us to actually decarbonize Scope 3 and our customer emissions. Now, just a second I want to spend on markets, just because another important point I think to reinforce. The energy transition is not going to be paved by the public sector alone or government grants. It has to be paved by the private sector. And I've spent quite a bit of time already talking about how do we create the right sorts of systems and criteria for investments to be made. This is crucial because the level of capital investment required is significant. But investors will make decisions if the economic and incentives are there. And they can make decisions based on good policy. And Canada already has a number of those, including policies that address heavy emitters, with based pricing systems, clean fuels regulations, and carbon pricing. When we as Shell look at Canada, we see some of these foundational policies which are crucial. We also see on the demand side and the customer side some other really good policies, again, connecting end to end. So you have zero emissions mandates, you have zero emissions tax credits. These sorts of things can drive consumer behaviors. We need to do that and at pace. We also see the role of carbon markets, and you might have spent some time already today talking about carbon markets, but they're fundamentally important, for us, where you have the opportunities of carbon markets to make the most efficient and economic investments to decarbonize over a period of time, while you begin to transfer technologies or make other investments over the longer term. Article 6 is another component of carbon markets, and that is something which Canada should not ignore, but find opportunities to leverage, because the world actually supports Article 6 if you consider what we were able to achieve at Glasgow. So speaking of international agreements, I just want to maybe spend the last part of my remarks speaking about Canada's role in the world. I'm not alone, and I'm sure many of you, I hope, feel the same way, that we as a country are endowed with incredible natural resources. And we have an opportunity to take advantage of these natural resources for ourselves but then also to supply the world. And I think this is coming to stark reality and recognition of what we see happening in Europe. But what is distressing and what we have to acknowledge is that Canada's role in the world in terms of an export is declining. We are not hitting at our weight, and we should be hitting at our weight. It doesn't need to be so, and it shouldn't be so, quite frankly, because we know as a trade-dependent economy, exporting products to the markets that need them creates wealth at home. And it allows us to recognize how we can be competitive with our peers by striving to get that market share. So one of the natural things we have in support of our natural resources, as we know, is lower carbon electricity. This becomes a critical input, as I described earlier, in terms of scope 2, in helping to generate lower carbon product. Carbon capture sequestration also enables us to generate lower carbon products and helps us to create lower carbon fuels. And so these are the sorts of things that we should be spending more time on, looking at what can we do to not only use these wonderful technologies and inputs for our own use, but then also for exports. When I worked on the LNG Canada project prior to coming in this role, you may have heard that we designed the project to have the lowest carbon intensity per unit of LNG produced anywhere in the world by any large LNG plant. We really set the benchmark. Now, benchmarks can be set across a multitude of sectors in Canada, just based on the fact that we have lower carbon electricity, with the ability to increase that with other sources of low carbon electricity, like small modular nuclear reactors, like geothermal. We have carbon capture sequestration. So what other benchmarks can we set? And now how do we monetize that in the world stage in terms of establishing our position as a global leader in low carbon exports? I like to refer to this as a little bit of brand Canada. And cheekily, I think about this, just like you see the food labels on your cereal box, we could have a brand Canada that has its own label that identifies our superiority as it relates to some of these key things that we think can set us apart from our peers. But we need to get these materials, we need to get these natural resources to market. So as I begin to close, I guess the challenge I want to throw into the room is that what is one of the greatest opportunities and challenges we have to net zero? And how can we now rally around that and find a way of actually achieving our domestic targets, but also positioning ourselves globally? What I'm experiencing, and maybe others of you are feeling this as well, is that we're still in a place where we're not aligned on that message, I should say. We still have provincial, federal regulations that don't really speak to each other. We have electricity grids that don't connect. We have political leaders that prefer to distance and deflect instead of collaborate and create. And yet I believe Canadians know how and want to rally behind a cause. So what is the cause? And even more appropriately, what is that mission we need to rally behind? Years ago, Canada demonstrated leadership in peacekeeping, and that became symbolized by the blue helmets. Now, isn't our new mission to produce the commodities the world needs, that while demonstrating these commodities can be produced, the lowest emissions, the most stringent, transparent, and efficient regulatory systems, that we can create multi-generational opportunities for Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, that we have also demonstrated how to create the most effective policy and regulatory systems that can accelerate and enable lower carbon investments across various different energy systems. And that as a nation, we have mitigated the most disruptive elements of the energy transition by careful planning, by balancing energy security, affordability, and decarbonization objectives together. Now, I believe we can do this, and this is certainly a cause that, while very difficult, I think we can rally behind. Now, I know I can rally behind that cause. Now, what about you? Thank you, Monica. That concludes my remarks for the day.
Great. Thank you so much, Susannah. I love the way you threw a challenge to the room and then you said, and by the way, here's the answer. Well done. Well done. So we have just a couple minutes left for questions. I want to ask you one, and then maybe we can take one from the audience. I'd love to get a sense from you, Susannah, of, on CCUS, what would that more collaborative, systems based across different levels of government, across different energy sectors, frankly, what might that look like? Be really interesting to hear from you on that point. Oh, your mute is on.
I guess I cut myself off. Sorry about that. So CCS from a systems perspective, CCS can be applied, as I mentioned, to capture scope 1. So we see that as a really fundamental technology for heavy emitters, such as cement and steel facilities. But it also CCS as a foundation for hydrogen, and that creates opportunities for us to actually reduce scope 3 So how does it work from a systems perspective? I think it's looking at what is the application? Is it simply for scope 1? Or is it for capturing emissions, but then also enabling scope 3 reductions? And that's really exciting, because if you can use CCS to create hydrogen to enable scope 3 reductions, you need to work with, well, what are the hydrogen offtake consumers look like? What are the sorts of technologies that need to be invested in, such as heavy and medium duty trucking, hydrogen locomotives, and other sources that can then take hydrogen for transportation? That's the more systems approach when you leverage CCS to generate hydrogen, as an example.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. And one of the other phrases that you used in your remarks, Susannah, that I'm going to steal is a regulatory roadmap. And what's the regulatory roadmap to support that? I think that's a really powerful concept. So we have maybe time for one question from the room or from our online audience, if we've got anybody who wants to jump in. Oh, we've got one coming for you here, Susannah.
Hi, Susannah. Thanks for the presentation. Great vision. Love the brand Canada stuff. Just had a question. We had a great panel just now on customer affordability, and all the technologies you're speaking about seem like they are going to require investment. And, you know, if my understanding of kind of markets and whatnot is right, will inevitably lead to higher costs. I think your brand Canada kind of answers like the global market piece. So maybe if, you know, brand can be strong, so maybe we will have a strong brand, albeit a little costly on global markets. But what do you think about the consumer piece? You know, we're already in a high cost environment for liquid fuels and energy in general. But, you know, what's the role, I guess, for governments and anyone else you think relevant in the customer affordability piece? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. A great question. I think, again, as a customer, part of what I would be looking to, for example, if I needed to invest in hydrogen trucks, for example, is I would want to know that hydrogen can be produced at a cost that I can afford, that the system is in place for me to allow access to the distribution network. And what do we need to do to make this happen? I think part of it is understand what are the cost constraints that we have today, and how, if we can scale up the amount of hydrogen we produce, that we can reduce that cost to the consumer. How can we scale up the number of trucks that are available so we can reduce that cost to the consumer? So it's looking at each piece of that value chain and saying, what would it take to scale that up? The role of government obviously is there as well. If government can provide incentives to invest in trucks, just as we're doing to invest in zero emissions vehicles, that can help reduce the barriers to entry, as can it create some greater predictability for us as an investor to invest in the hydrogen production so we can produce more. So it's an end-to-end conversation. It's an identification of what are the gaps or what are the competitiveness challenges. It's a role of government to help us accelerate and scale up some of these investments. So it's not just one investor, it could be multiple, so pooling resources. Those are the things that we need to think about, recognizing, again, these are going to be more expensive, but if we really want to scale them up, it's going to require that we have predictability, but it also requires that we can invest at scale. And so that's some of the things that, it's not a perfect answer, but it's the only way we can actually work end to end, increasing certainty, and then commercializing and scaling up the technology so it becomes more affordable.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susannah. And I think I can speak on behalf of everyone here, even though you weren't in the room in person. It definitely felt like you were here. All the energy, pardon the pun, that you bring to your remarks is definitely felt in the room. We really appreciate your making the time, particularly when you're, you know, looking to spend some time with your children. We hope you enjoy the remainder of your time with them before they head off for the summer. And I want to just invite the room to join me in thanking you for your remarks today.
Thanks, Monica.
So we now move to a presentation, a keynote from Nik Nanos. Susannah mentioned about what Canadians think about these issues, and we'd provided Susannah with an advanced copy of Nik's presentation, so I think she had that a little bit top of mind. Nik chairs our advisory council at Positive Energy, and it's been nothing short of just a real delight and learning experience to work with Nik. Lots of fun collaboration over the last half a dozen years or so. So, you know, we worked together with Nik to identify a number of questions that you know, in essence, are asking Canadians about their views on the topics that we're talking about today here at this conference. So it's one thing for us, you know, energy experts and environmental experts in those communities to come together. It's another thing to hear from Canadians and what they actually think of the issues. So Nik, over to you.
Yeah, I can manage. And, actually, Monica, I do have a question for you, because you said working together has been a learning experience. Is that a positive, negative, or neutral learning experience? I'm not sure. So it's kind of like being, oh, that was a learning experience, and everybody's rolling their eyes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to join you and to share the latest round of research that we've done with the team at Positive Energy. But I'd like to pause for a second, because, we've been talking today, and one of the things that's come up is that not only has there been change, but everything has changed in terms of the world that we're in right now. And to put this into context, if you had asked me back in January 2020, before the pandemic, what would we be talking about for that year, it would have been very different, because in January 2020, and we track every week the top national issue of concern that's unprompted. People can say whatever they want. And the top national issue of concern in January 2020 was the environment, actually, by a country mile. And I would have said at that time that perhaps 2020 was a moment in time where we were able to talk about a lot of those aspirations, those environmental aspirations, and what I'll say, tough decisions that would need to be made in order for our country to move forward. And then something called the pandemic knocked everything off the radar, as Canadians were fixated on the pandemic. And it's one of those things there that if the pandemic wasn't enough, then it was the war in the Ukraine, and then it was the rising cost of living. And through that whole period, when we'd ask independently how important the environment is, it still score very highly. But that when we ask what's top of mind and what is focusing Canadians, it would be lower down on the grid. But I still think when we're looking at the trends, is that the environment still will be poised to come back on the agenda, except twinned with a lot of other issues. And, Monica, I was very interested this morning when you were talking about the unnamed, it's kind of like those TV shows somewhere in America, some professor someplace who said that, energy policy is environmental policy. And I think that's actually, I guess everything's on the record. That's actually part of the problem, is that energy policy, which should be included as part of economic policy, national policy. It should include the environment, a whole bunch of other dimensions, many of which we heard about today, has been more single dimensional, at least for average Canadians. And that's the problem, that we haven't been able to talk about what type of standard of living that we'd like to have. We haven't been able to talk about how competitive we want to be as a nation. And we've been focused on other things. But I think that's one of the reasons why, at least for me, Positive Energy has been appealing, because it's the smart discussions that really should be taking place that really need to be moved forward. So as I do the walk through the numbers, you'll hear some things that are very, very familiar, because what you'll see is that although Canadians are not public policy experts, they understand that there is a fundamental problem that we have, and that there is an urgency and an appetite to act. So I'm going to, and I'm assuming that the presentation will be publicly available, so don't worry about jotting everything down. If you'd like to, you can, but everything will be shared through the Positive Energy team. But the purpose basically was for us to set the table, to bring Canadians' voice to the table, right? Not just regulators, not just stakeholders, not just government, not just industry, but to bring the voice of Canadians to the table. And we wanted to unpack everything ranging from views and awareness of net zero through to polarization, Canada's energy future, and how we're doing. A bit of a report card. And I'll tell you, it's a dismal report card, not to scoop myself, in terms of how Canadians think we're doing in terms of the job on a lot of these energy and environmental files. But what's interesting, and I thought, you look at the numbers, and because we live this, we think everybody knows and everybody is engaged on net zero. But beyond the fact that 3 out of every 4 Canadians report that they're aware of, and what we tested on, Canada's net zero target, But you can see that if you happen to be someone that lives in the prairies, you're much more likely to report being aware than someone of Canada's net zero target than someone in Quebec. And I think for one of the things that could explain that, and of course we'd need to do another round of research or exploratory work to explain some of those regional variations, because there weren't really very many significant other variations, but to explain those two regional variations is that if you happen to live in the province of Quebec, you are fortunate enough to live in a province that on the environmental front is blessed with a lot of renewable hydropower. And focusing on Canada's net zero is kind of like, yeah, but we're more focused on what's happening in Quebec. However, if you happen to be on the prairies, when they hear the term Canada's net zero target, they're thinking of something from that far off place called Ottawa, where we are, that is impacting in a material way their economy and their day-to-day lives. So, I put that on the table. And, the other interesting thing is that, people kind of do have a general idea of what it's about, but there's still a significant proportion of Canadians that are unsure. So, we throw out the term net zero, and we have to remember that if we walk down the street in our neighborhood, 1 out of every 4 Canadians just haven't heard of it, and that a significant proportion don't really have defined views on what net zero means. So there's education that needs to take place. And one of the things, and Marissa and I, we were talking this morning about the research that she was doing, and she was talking about realities, remember? Reality 1, and you're going to get into this, reality 1 and reality 2, and then we talk about is there a reality 3 and 4? I'm not going to scoop your work, but I love that lens on polarization and the realities that are there. But, when we talk about polarization, and we all unpack polarization in our day-to-day lives, like, let's face it, I'm not going to ask you to do a poll, but how many times have you been in a situation where you want to avoid a conversation with someone that because it might be about something sensitive that that you don't agree on, whether it's American politics or anything else. But the interesting thing is that when we're testing on polarization on climate action, is that compared to our previous wave of research, there's a greater number of Canadians that would say that there is lower agreement than our last wave of research. So it's going in the wrong direction, as opposed to saying that there is a consensus potentially developing, or that there's a greater number of Canadians that are in agreement. We're actually seeing things move in the wrong direction with about a material 7-point delta, at least compared to the 2021 data. The good news is that when we test on things as to whether Canada should meet its climate commitments, even if it means energy prices increasing, that has been pretty steady. That not quite by a 2-to-1 margin, a little less, that Canadians are more likely to agree or somewhat agree with that. And you'll notice in a lot of the work that we do with positive energy, where we always present a trade-off, because nothing is for free, right? So we'd always say, would you like to achieve this if energy prices went up, or if there was a cost to the economy? So on the whole idea of meeting those commitments, still pretty strong support, and consistently strong support, at least even compared to before the pandemic. Now, and whether this is a timely moment in our history to be ambitious, we've seen that decline a little bit. And I think I would hazard to say that a lot of that has to do with the fact that energy prices are on the rise, and that an increasing number of Canadians are being a little more tentative. The good news is that it's still, 24 points higher. The folks that believe that it's the best time are about 24 points higher in that column, as opposed to individuals who think it's the worst time. But the reality is there's been a little bit, the ambition is still there, and it's still by a very comfortable margin, but it's potentially softening. And we don't know whether this is a new trend or whether this is potentially short term. But the thing is that on the climate ambition front, we can see that if you happen to be in central Canada, in Quebec and Ontario, that the appetite for climate ambition is actually much stronger compared to individuals that live in the prairie provinces. You know, the other thing is this, on this level of agreement, there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but if you look at the box and the two columns on the far right, what you can see is that the level of agreement scores have generally gone down or have gone down in every single region. And to put this into context, this is not a 5-point scale. This is a 10-point scale. So, you know, think of it this way. In every single region, people score a fail on level of agreement, regardless of where you are. With you can see with some regions actually scoring it almost like an absolute or significant fail. So, you know, I put that on the table in terms of the potential trend and where things are going. You know, I was quite struck with Suzanne's comment about needing to be more competitive. I'll just paraphrase her that we need to be more competitive internationally, and we had to think about how we could be more proactive on that front. And, you know, talking about the brand and a lot of other items. You know, the good news is that Suzanne didn't need to hire me to figure that out because she figured that out on her own. I'm here to tell you that Canadians agree with what she says on these fronts. And you can see that, you know, when we tested on this whole concept of exports from our oil and gas sector contributing to combat global climate change, that you know, Canadians almost by a margin of 3-1 agree with that statement, and that you know, support for that or that particular perception has been fairly strong over the last number of years. And you know, even testing on, you can see on the right-hand side, Canada should expand oil and gas exports to help the world have more secure and reliable energy supplies. That you know, a fairly comfortable majority, you know, 58% of Canadians agree or somewhat agree. And, you know, I put this into context is that in a world where governments are formed on 33% or 32%, to have 58% of Canadians agree on anything is actually quite striking. You might not think, well, that's not as high as, you know, the whole idea of combating global climate change. But the reality is that that is quite strong. And, you know, not a big surprise that on the regional variations, that if you happen to live in the prairies, you're more likely to be hot on that idea. And, you know, a majority of Canadians basically in every single region would agree with this whole idea of exports to help contribute to combat global climate change. A little lower in Quebec. But the other interesting thing is that there has been, at least compared to the 2018 benchmark, a little bit of a weakening. But the reality is that the scores are quite strong. And, you know, the other thing that I thought was quite interesting is that, you know, we profile based on the parties that people self-identify that they usually support on a regular basis. And I thought it was quite interesting that even 52% of people that say that they vote for the New Democrats basically say that they would be good with Canada's exports contributing to combat global climate change. And not a big surprise if you happen to be an individual that supports the Liberals or the Conservatives federally, that level of support and agreement is actually quite stronger. So you know, the good news is that there's context. There's actually context. There's political license for action on a lot of these files. The bad news is actually on the trust front, and we've been tracking the trust numbers for actually quite a while. I think since Monica, since back in 2015. It was one of the very first things that we did because we wanted to measure together with Positive Energy how people felt about different stakeholders and players and the level of trust. So the good news for Positive Energy is that universities are still consistent. They've been consistently first in almost every wave of research, although, you know, there are times when people are unsure who they trust. when it comes to responsible dialogue. But what I put on the table, and you can see above some of these bar charts, Ontario, Quebec, the prairies, BC prairies, what I actually thought was quite striking was that depending on where you live, you trust different organizations in terms of the second organization beyond universities. So if you happen to live in the prairies, the stakeholder that you trusted most to advance responsible dialogue about the economy and the energy sector and the environment was actually your provincial government. If you lived in Quebec, it was not the federal government, it was not even the provincial government, it was environmental groups. If you were in Ontario, it was the federal government. What does this mean operationally if you have a project? What this means is that to have a national engagement strategy on responsible dialogue, that you actually have to customize that depending on the region that you're in. Because you know what, there's no use, for example, in going into Quebec and not talking about environmental groups, because environmental groups are the ones that are trusted the most. And there's no way that you can go into the prairies without some sort of tip of the hat or connection with provincial governments, because for those Canadians that live in the prairies, it's the provincial government that they're more likely to trust the most. And I know it makes it a little more difficult to navigate, but you know, the reality is that we actually have, I would almost call them trust silos, that I can't stand before you today and say, beyond saying universities, but when it comes to universities plus, who's the plus one on the trust experience? I can't give you an example, or I can't give you an answer to say who the plus one might be, because that answer is very different in different parts of the country. Now, on the report card, here's where I get to really cheer you up. You can see that similar to the discussions that we've been having all morning, Canadians give poor marks, very few give positive marks on anything governments. And we're not talking about the government of Canada, we're just talking about governments. They don't give positive marks on anything, ranging from collaborating with each other to balance Canada's economic, environmental, and energy objectives, through to making sure that energy is affordable, through to providing clear and predictable policy and a regulatory environment. You can see that people are 9 times more likely to give a poor than a positive mark on collaboration. 7 times more likely to give a poor than a positive score on affordability. And still 5 times more likely to give a negative score on providing a predictable regulatory environment. So if as Monica knows, I have 4 boys, if the Nanos brothers came home with stuff like this, it'd be like, time to rethink everything, right? That we have to think of a new approach, that there's a fundamental problem, and that Canadians understand and get the dysfunction. The reality is that we've all been living it. You know, it's stuff where we're talking about it a lot, but it just seems to be like, here's a question. When was the last time there was good news? Can you hear the crickets? Yes. No, just thinking policy good news where, you know, something happened and Canadians thought that it was a positive step forward on the policy, the regulatory front. It's just not there. And, you know, so should we be surprised when Canadians score domestically governments writ large so poorly, that when we ask about our credibility internationally, check out these numbers. So this is Canada's credibility on the international stage compared to other countries when it comes to environmental policies on climate change. And you would think for a policy area that is such a high priority for this government that the numbers would be positive. But, you know, you can see the red that, you know, back in 2018, 31% thought that our credibility was less or somewhat less than other countries. Now it's up to a full 44%. So for anything, regardless of what any happy face that an elected official might want to put on things, Canadians believe that we're laggards and that it's moving in a different direction. So, you know, this is my last slide before we kind of open it up, because I'm more interested, Monica and Michael, to the conversation that we're going to have, but I just want to put some final 3 big takeaways from this research and other research that we've done with positive energy and on this file. So everyone agrees on the diagnosis, and we've heard it this morning, that there's a problem. It's kind of like the patient is there and we can observe all the illnesses that the patient has, right? And we know that. The other thing is that there's generally pretty good agreement on the destination, right? And if we use the patient analogy, the destination is to get healthy, right? And functional. And that destination being less carbon intensive, more environmentally responsible. But what I want to put on the table, and I'm not sure how popular or unpopular this might be, is that based on the research, a lot of the other research that we've done, is that although we agree on the diagnosis and although we agree on the destination, Canadians are agnostic on the journey. It's kind of like going to the doctor, right? That's all they want, is to talk to the professional and the physician for that person to say, here's what this is your treatment, right? And Canadians generally are agnostic. They are suspicious, as we talked about earlier, of governments picking winners and losers. And that being the frame for many Canadians and some of the other research that we've done, but they're agnostic. You know, it's just what they want to see is kind of movement and moving forward. And the other thing, if I might hazard one final comment, Monica, is that they are suspicious of governments that say that there is a large solution. You know, I think incrementalism, even though there's a sense of urgency, there has to be some wins. You know, when you look at the numbers on a lot of these things, the climate and ambition is there, the openness to Canada kind of being part of that global energy solution is there, but we need to have a win. There needs to be something to put in the window that's symbolic of progress before Canadians kind of have a little more confidence in where our governments writ large are taking us. So Monica, with that, I close out. Thank you very much for your attention. And I take it I sit at a chair, one of the comfy chairs, or, oh, yes, I'll take questions. So if you could please identify yourself and ask me a question, that would be great. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Paul Chiliak with the Canadian Gas Association based in Ottawa. There seemed to be a bit of a dichotomy in some of the findings. I wonder if you could dig down a bit.
Yep.
One of the findings, I don't know what slide it was, said people are prepared to pay more for greener energy. But then on another slide, over half the people thought that governments were doing a poor job on energy affordability.
Yep.
What is that telling us? Is
So
that because it was from February opposed to if you did that today when prices have escalated?
no, actually, so we do in the private sector, we do a lot of price sensitivity research. Can I tell you something? It doesn't matter whatever we've done price sensitivity research on, people always complain that the price is too high, but they end up paying for it if they see that there's value. So will people complain about the price? Yes. Will people want the government? And actually, it would be interesting. I think actually what people want is more price stability because they want to be able to plan their lives. You know, the interesting thing is that individuals are really no different than organizations, right? Organizations need stability in order to make decisions and plan for the future. Canadians need stability. So for example, if Canadians knew that the price of energy was going to be at a certain level, they'd probably in the long term start changing behavior. They'd be like, maybe I should walk to work, right? So to your point, Paul, what we find, at least in our research, and I think it also relevant to this research, is that Canadians will always complain about the price. But the good news is now compared to 5 years ago, They understand that there is a price that needs to be paid. And, 5-10 years ago, when we would do research, they'd always say, oh, we'd like companies to bear the price of all these things. Now, Canadians understand that they actually have to pay the price, but it'll always be too much. Yep. Okay.
Thank you, John Dillon with the Business Council of Canada. One of the last points you made was that your polling reveals a certain dissatisfaction of Canadians with the inability to deliver a clear and predictable regulatory environment. And as you would know, that's something that we in business tend to complain a lot about. But I guess we traditionally have always assumed that Canadians don't pay much attention to the regulatory system and might actually believe that it's a good thing that our regulatory system is difficult and complex and all potential factors are considered. So I'm curious as to what you think is behind that. Are Canadians paying a lot more attention now to our regulatory system? Are they hearing more about it? And is that something that governments really need to respond to?
It's interesting, John, in the polling, when we'd ask Canadians to justify why they gave such low scores, usually at the very top of the list would be provincial governments and the federal government working at cross purposes. So, regulatory would be like, our governance is broken on this. The fact of the matter is that if we decided that we were going to make a new country called Canada, and we were talking about what are national responsibilities and what provincial responsibilities, a lot of them would probably be the same as where we're at. Like people would say, okay, schools should be run locally to kind of reflect the communities and the provinces that they're based on. But yes, we'd like national standards, but local hospitals would be good so that they're responsive to the community. They'd also agree that nationally we would need to have defense run nationally because that is a national interest. But I think if it came to energy and the environment specifically, they'd be going, hold on a second. I think we can't have a patchwork process and be internationally competitive and to meet our environmental aspirations and to have a strong economy. So, I would almost say that this is an area where, there's an appetite for figuring out a way to make our federation work so that we can meet our environmental aspirations and at the same time make sure that our economy remains strong. So I think the regulatory, John, to your point, is kind of code for governance and our provinces and the federal government being kind of balkanized and not being in agreement on this. So, okay, Monica. Super. Anyways, thanks everybody.